Matthew Aucoin is joining us today from New York. He'll be visiting Seattle's Meany Center for the Performing Arts on November 1st with his new evening-length work, Music for New Bodies, which he's created in collaboration with director Peter Sellars. Matthew, thanks for coming on the show to talk about it.
Oh, thanks for having me, Mike.
We've been over your biography. You were born and raised in Boston and went to Harvard, where you majored in poetry, I believe.
Yeah, in English, focusing on poetry.
You know, there's another famous composer who went to Harvard and majored in literature instead of music.
Are you talking about Mr. Carter by any
Exactly.
chance?
Elliot
Yeah.
Carter, who wound up teaching at Juilliard, where you went after Harvard. And you began working as an assistant conductor at the Metropolitan Opera, which is just across the street. But your interest in that art form must have gone back much further. What attracted you to opera, and to contemporary opera in particular?
I think anyone with my range of interests in music above all, but also drama, storytelling, poetry, is kind of doomed to work in opera or some mode of musical theater because it's a place where these fields are kind of gathered together. And I caught the bug pretty early. Somebody in my family had the really good idea of bringing home some videos of the Mozart operas when I was quite young, and I still think those pieces are fantastic for kids. There's a directness, an emotional directness that can really speak to a curious kid. But it was only much later that I kind of woke up and looked beyond the kind of hermetic world of, music lessons and so on, to notice that there's actually a music world out there right now, and there are people still making operas and orchestral pieces and chamber pieces. So it's really, I would say, only when I was in college that I thought, no, maybe I could actually do this. Maybe I could make my own operas and start forging my own body of work.
In music school, I encountered technical and historical definitions of opera that went to whether the music was sung through or whether there was spoken dialogue, that kind of thing. And the word opera simply means work, as in work of art in Italian. In the real world, though, people usually think of opera as the music that's sung on stage by opera singers.
Mm.
How would you define opera?
Well, I co-founded an ensemble called AMOC, AMOC, which stands for the American Modern Opera Company. And we kind of have our own definition of opera, which is that it's the art form where every art form collides. And so for us, especially when I collaborate with AMOC, as I am on this piece, Music for New Bodies, that's coming to the Meany Center on November 1st, for us, an opera can be a duet between a violinist and a dancer. It can be any kind of interdisciplinary art form. I think, late Beckett plays feel like operas because the silence is so intensely charged that there's music happening. There's a kind of through line of music that renders the piece interdisciplinary. So I'm interested in that kind of collision, which is why, even though some people might know me for kind of large scale operas like Eurydice, I'm also working in other scales and other more experimental modes as well.
We just heard music that you arranged from your opera Eurydice, which seems to be your breakthrough piece. It was premiered by LA Opera in 2020 and produced at the Met the following year. And it's available to stream through Met Opera On Demand.
As well as Apple Music, actually. The Met's recording is also on Apple Music.
That's good to know. We'll play some of that in the background. How does your adaptation differ from traditional versions of the Orpheus and Eurydice story?
I think it differs so much that it's almost a different story altogether. This is something that I only realized partway through composing the opera, but it's based on a beautiful play by Sarah Rule, the playwright who was also my collaborator on the opera.
Her play is also called Eurydice.
It is, yeah. And I think that what's kind of ingenious about the play is that it embeds the myth within a larger narrative, which is really the story of a young woman figuring out who she is through multiple lifetimes and multiple cycles of life and death. Her relationship with her father, who she encounters in the underworld. Her father has predeceased her, and there's this kind of beautiful moment of encounter after death, after her memory has been erased, as she's passed through the river of forgetfulness. None of these things are present in the myth as we know it. And so I began to wonder whether Sarah had kind of brilliantly treated the myth almost as a kind of Trojan horse for this larger and more capacious story of her own. That felt pretty liberating to me, because it felt to me like we could almost invite opera audiences in. Like, you think you know how this goes, and then you enter a totally different space.
I think you've said that we all know who Orpheus is, but Eurydice is a wild card.
Yeah, in most of the familiar stories, Eurydice is a nobody, which makes her a blank canvas for someone like Sarah to invent a new character. So the story's great, the character was never so great, and Sarah made something entirely new of her.
What are you thinking about? Music.
You wrote about the Orpheus myth in your book, The Impossible Art. You called it opera's foundational story, and you've said that his fateful backward glance at Eurydice was opera's original sin. What did you mean by that?
Well, the Orpheus story glorifies music in a way that no other story that I know does. It claims that music can conquer death. But it's not sentimental about that, because it's also quite brutal about human beings. It says music will conquer death, but we will inevitably screw things up. And Orpheus does.
It seems you felt his sin might be a preference for singing about Eurydice rather than actually living with her.
Yeah, a preference for singing and for music, period, over human relationships, which is kind of a secret dynamic in all opera, I think, which is that even in the most tragic pieces, in a way, the more extreme the tragedy, the more pleasurable the catharsis is for the performers and for the audience. I mean, what is the art form if not this kind of excuse to transform these unbearable experiences into the most overwhelming and beautiful experiences? It's present in Strauss and Verdi and Wagner and many other great opera composers. So I think that the Orpheus story kind of crystallizes this kind of tendency to wallow in the pleasure of music, to wallow in grief. And then the art form proceeded to do exactly that for 400 more years.
The earliest operas that came out of Florence around 1600 were mainly settings of the Orpheus myth. I guess it was easier for audiences to accept having the actors sing their lines if the main character was himself a bard. But you mentioned Verdi, and we're hearing some of the infernal music from your opera that I've always wanted to ask if it was intended to remind us of the Dies Irae from Verdi's Requiem.
Not specifically, but I love practically every note Verdi ever wrote. I just think he had these kind of animal instincts for what works emotionally and dramatically. He had these fantastic instincts. He knows when something's going to go on for a second too long, and he cuts it short. And he knows when he can lean in and luxuriate in a scene. So I treat Verdi as a kind of dramatic North Star. So, it may very well, the Dies Irae may have crept in there subconsciously.
Well, that brings us to your new project, Music for New Bodies, coming soon to Meany Center in Seattle. Tickets and information are at meanycenter.org. It's officially described as a chamber opera. It's based on poems by Jorie Graham, who shares a connection to Harvard. And your other collaborator is Peter Sellars, the noted stage director, who has contributed his own long and poetic description of the piece that I can't do justice to. But my impression is that it's a collection of staged songs about someone or multiple people trying to connect with themselves and each other. Am I close to the mark with that?
In a way, yes. I've started thinking of the piece as a vocal symphony more than an opera because the logic of how it moves from one movement to the next is a musical logic, not only a dramatic logic. It's not like this character is cheating on this other character, so, chaos ensues. It's not quite that kind of piece. It's more that we are in the mind of a person, the speaker in Jorie Graham's poems. And some of these poems deal with a kind of medical crisis. There's a sense that this person is undergoing very intense treatment of some kind. But that is really only one element of it, because whoever this person is, their mind ranges from questions of ecological collapse. There's an entire long movement spoken by the voice of the bottom of the ocean, like we're consulting an oracle. And in other movements, the speaker of these poems really considers what we have done to ourselves by rendering so much of the world virtual and synthetic. There's this question of, have we given away the farm to disembodied voices? So there's a kind of dialogue between embodied human beings and disembodied voices. And I would say the shape of the piece is from a kind of terrified chaos, of confronting exactly the moment that we are living in and wondering what it means to be a person with a body in a moment when our species is giving away embodiment, towards, at the end of the piece, a really deep groundedness. The last movement features a voice from not the ocean, but kind of the core of the earth. We hear this voice of the earth speaking up to us and saying, kind of, don't let go. So I think of the piece, the drama of the piece, as charting an arc from a kind of existential terror to a new kind of groundedness. It will, I hope, feel operatic in its intensity, and certainly, the piece features 5 singers and a chamber orchestra of 18 players, plus electronics. I'll be conducting. And the 5 singers are all one consciousness in a way, so that sometimes it feels like it's 5 distinct beings, and then it kind of snaps together and they speak with this intense unity. So that dynamic creates its own drama, but it's not the drama of, Tosca or Aida.
You mentioned the chamber orchestra you're using. It's relatively conventionally proportioned, except there's no brass. What's that all about?
I would complicate the proportions in one way, which is that our 4 percussionists play a battery of percussion instruments that is so gigantic. They probably play 75 or 80 instruments over the course of the evening. So the percussion setup, let me tell you, trying to tour this piece, the percussion setup is a bit of a nightmare. But Peter Sellars, who is brilliantly and very tenderly staging the piece, had this wonderful insight, which is that some of the movements take place in a kind of hospital setting. And he realized that the percussion setup, which is front and center in the middle of the stage, looks like all these instruments that you might see in a hospital. There's wires and there's large marimbas that are like gurneys, and so the percussion creates this sort of jungle at the center of the stage. So that's a little bit unusual, just the sheer scale of it. But you asked about brass instruments. There's no brass in this piece, in part because sometimes brass will overwhelm a chamber orchestra if you're not careful. I could have snuck in a couple of brass instruments, but I somehow I had the blend that I wanted with strings, winds, percussion, and also keyboards, including an electronic Fender Rhodes keyboard and harp.
You mentioned your director, Peter Sellars, who you've worked with before as a conductor, but this is the first time you've created a piece together. Sellars is known for his provocative stagings that are sometimes controversial. He was John Adams' partner for Nixon in China and Dr. Atomic, and he also directed Kaya Saariaho's first two operas. But then there was a production he did of Ligoti's opera Le Grand Macabre that so infuriated the composer that he tried to have it shut down. How do you ensure success when you're working with such a strong-minded collaborator?
The thing I love about Peter is that he always pushes his collaborators to be the freest and wildest and most honest version of themselves. And to the question of, how does one work with a collaborator who has really strong ideas, I learned pretty early on that Peter's also a really lovely person. And if something wasn't working, I could just say, sorry, Peter, I can't make this sing. And the extraordinary thing with Peter was he gave me a million ideas, and even some of the ideas that did not make it into the piece informed it. He had some wonderful ideas about slowing certain sections down, expanding them, adding more voices, musical ideas as well as theatrical ones.
I'm speaking with composer Matthew Aucoin, who spells his name Aucoin, which means in the corner in French. And this coming week, he'll be in our corner of the world, conducting Music for New Bodies at Meany Center on the UW campus. Performance is Saturday, November 1st at 7:30 p.m. Tickets and information are at meanycenter.org, and we'll see you there. Matt, I want to ask you about the state of opera, which is a huge topic. Opera companies have been struggling financially for a while, and not just in the U.S., but there's also a pretty insidious cultural war that's broken out in America. And given the environment that we're facing in fall 2025, what should opera companies and opera composers be doing to survive and to have a positive impact?
Well, the first thing is to only produce works that you really believe in. I think that the dangerous thing about the moment we're living in with the current administration is that, unlike the first time that Donald Trump was president, this time they have noticed that culture is important. This time they care about the Kennedy Center. This time, it's a little bit more of a sophisticated move, frankly, and for that reason, more dangerous. And the temptation, as with one of those, sophisticated autocratic takeovers, the temptation will just be to be 30% more careful. You just self-censor. So I think that what opera companies and artists need to do is to first ask, am I saying the thing that is most urgent to me right now? And do I believe in, can I stand behind everything that we are putting on? Not that everything has to address contemporary issues directly. Often the most effective pieces do so at an angle or in a mysterious way. But I think the first thing we need to do is not self-censor. And I think also be honest about, things that might have been courageous in a different era. It's possible for things to kind of become kitsch over time. We have to keep asking ourselves what's urgent right now.
I think there's a growing sentiment that whatever the motivations might have been, the insistence from parts of the left on politicizing American culture in a pretty explicit way, whether it's programming or things like ritualized land acknowledgments, which are still common in the Northwest, has been counterproductive. That we've preached to the choir, that we've made people who aren't in the choir feel unwelcome, that even people who are sympathetic to the choir, but who don't enjoy being preached at, are themselves feeling estranged from the cultural left. Is it possible that we need to rebalance things in a way that might actually lead to better political and artistic results?
Well, I think that the most on the nose, the pieces that announce themselves as political in the most direct way are rarely the most artistically interesting, and they're often quite aesthetically conservative too.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I'm not a fan of jingoistic art, no matter where it's coming from, no matter what side of the spectrum it's coming from. You know, the piece that I just wrote earlier this year is a setting of poetry by a Chilean writer named Raúl Zurita. My piece is called Song of the Reappeared, and the soprano Julia Bullock will premiere it with the Chicago Symphony in December. And I've become so fascinated with Zurita. He was kidnapped, I think tortured, in the early days of the Pinochet regime and was banned for a long time in his own country. And he found the most creative ways to quietly and nonviolently resist, you know, writing poems out of stones in the Atacama Desert, or with contrails in the sky, you know, with an airplane. And the poetry of his that I'm setting, it memorializes the victims of disappearances in Chile, but does so in a way that imagines these kind of scenes of resurrection. It's like a great surrealist painting or something. It's this vision of kind of the return of the people who were lost. I guess what I'm getting at is it works because it is fierce and beautiful, not because it is doing the most obvious thing. It's this vision of resurrection of the people who've been lost, and through its sheer intensity and beauty, you have no doubt what it's talking about, but it's less explicit or on the nose than it could have been.
My guest is Matthew Aucoin. If you're in Chicago, you can see Song of the Reappeared December 4th through 7th at Symphony Center. If you're in the Northwest, then catch him in person this coming Saturday, November 1st at Meany Center on the campus of the University of Washington. He'll be performing his vocal symphony, Music for New Bodies, in a concert staging by director Peter Sellars. We've got another selection from that piece lined up, and Matt, I'm hoping you can introduce it. It's from the fourth of the opera's 5 movements. What are we going to hear?
We're about to hear a moment when the speaker of this poem, our protagonist, who is portrayed by all 5 singers, has just had a very intense operation. And this person is emerging again into consciousness. And it's that moment of you've just been through something really intense when you weren't even conscious for it. And you wake up and you slowly realize, I'm okay. I made it. I'm alive. But as you step out into the hospital parking lot, you're also plagued by this sense of, am I really the same person? Do I really have everything I had before? Has something been taken from me? In the beautiful final lines of the poem, the speaker asks herself, and you get a little extra life to live. Can you still live it?
Wow, thank you for that poignant introduction, and for joining us on Flotation Device. Matthew, it's been great chatting with you, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the Northwest.
Mike, thank you for having me. Can't wait to join you in Seattle.
Here is Music for New Bodies by Matthew Aucoin.